This week, people in the capital city were flooded with a heavy rainstorm, and much of that water has now receded. But some people do have a real mess on their hands. Joining me in this evening's KX conversation is David Stradinger, who works for the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality, visiting a little bit about high water. David, thanks so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me.
So it's a 12 months a year job, but after something like this with heavy rain that comes suddenly, a person can be left with a real mess on their hands. In this case, if we're talking about flash flooding, that can be an overwhelming situation for a person if they might be a renter or even a homeowner. Something like that, David, what is the first thing a person should do?
First thing is think about your own health and safety. You need to, put that number one on your list. But you need to think about potential cleanup, what you're dealing with, some of the implications that will follow the flooding once the water is subsided. Dealing with possible renovations, removal of materials. We're dealing with water here, so eventually you may end up with some mold issues, which definitely becomes a health hazard. That's probably the one that you want to probably think about up front, other than making sure that your properties looked at. And that's one of the things you might want to start with, is making sure you do a good evaluation of your property. A lot of the heavy rain also has some hail along with it, so there may be additional areas within your home or in your buildings that may have some additional damage that you're not aware of, which could allow water to seep in as well. So those are, I think I would start there. Make sure that you get a good evaluation of your home. Check all the damage to start with.
And people are pretty savvy for the most part. You talk about taking pictures, documenting everything you come across. I mean, even whether it's hands-on tools, wet dry vacs, pumps, buckets of bleach, everything else. But anything else, I guess, and as you said, with that air, you don't know what kind of particles are in that air. So if you can mask up doing all this job, it may save you not just from getting sick, but anything else. What else could be a common mistake that you run into that people often make?
Well, for one thing, you need to think about what's contained in that water in itself. It's not your standard water. It could be some biological material in there. It could be some chemical material in there. So you need to treat it appropriately. There's could be fumes involved if you're dealing with any kind of a fuel tank, things like that. Some people, if they're living with fuel oil in their homes, you need to think about the vapors involved with that. And when you start thinking about the cleanup, and when you're in a specific area, you want to make sure that you cordon off that area, to where anything that might become airborne is going to stay in that area. So, you want to be able to make sure you're wearing the proper protective equipment, the personal protective equipment, or PPE. Like you're talking about with the masks, you might want to think about eyewear to avoid splashing in your eyes, wearing gloves, things like that, because of all those additional materials that may be included in the water and eventually will, or maybe absorbed in some of the building materials, the more porous materials like sheetrock and, wallboard, things like that, will absorb the material. So
How does a person know when it's time to bite the bullet and just call a pro?
Well, we do start off that direction. We recommend that you check into professionals to come and investigate, especially when you're dealing with probability of mold. You've got things that other things to worry about, such as asbestos. There might be some asbestos in the building materials itself. Those can be a big hazard to your airways, to your lungs. And there are specific regulations, regarding removal of asbestos. You need to take that into consideration. So we always recommend you start to check with a professional. They're the ones that are trained in it. They know the ins and outs. But some homeowners will decide to do it on their own. If they do so, I would still suggest that they get the house inspected to start with to see what types of hazards that they may be dealing with, and that's where the professionals come in. If you're dealing with a commercial building, institutional building, any public building, they're regulated. They need to follow the asbestos regulations regarding, the buildings are required to be inspected for asbestos before any renovation or demolition is done. And this has to be done by a certified and licensed company within the state.
Our guest once again is David Stradinger from North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality. If you have questions and need some helpful information, it may be worth a phone call. Their number is 701-328-5150. You can also send them an email with any issues or questions at deq@nd.gov. David, I want to thank you again so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.